Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Hey, we've had a great time here in Austin, Texas for ChefConf. We've had some terrific interviews with people who've been talking about open source, continuous automation, the new complexities of AI and compliance and security. We really covered it all. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at ChefConf in Austin, Texas. It is a cloudy Tuesday afternoon here in Austin. I'm here with John Gossman with Microsoft. Hey, John.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. John, tell us a little bit about what you do at Microsoft. And the subject of our conversation really is about open source at Microsoft. And so look, just to hear a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I'm an architect in the Azure core team. Basically, the Azure core team, we write the software that runs the data centers, right from the lowest level all the way down to like firmware up to the public APIs. And then so if Azure Stack is kind of the bottom of the Azure core Azure is the bottom of the stack, then I work at the top of the bottom, which is developer experiences and public APIs and things like that.
Okay. How long have you been at Microsoft?
I've been at Microsoft for 17 years, amazingly enough. Worked in a lot of different parts of the company, Office, developer division, Windows, and then the last 5 years in Azure.
What's the difference now at Microsoft with this relatively new I don't think it's relatively new, but you guys have always been involved in the kernel development and issue and technology such as that. But there's been a really renewed interest in open source at Microsoft. How does that correlate to you from the days when you were there back in the 90s and such?
Yeah, well, it's I think some of it's just generational. If you look at many corporations, they're going through that same mode. Open source is just increasingly becoming the way that people develop software.
Yeah.
And so, we get more and more people who are into Microsoft who are familiar with that. Then the second factor is that we are running a cloud service. And in a cloud service, you have to meet the customers where they're at. And there's no enterprise on the planet that's like an all Windows .NET shop. They're all, or an all Java Linux shop either. So in order to run a service, you have to operate everything. And at that point, you want to operate everything really well. But then finally, the great thing about open source is that a community like that allows you to scale beyond an organization. And even a big organization like Microsoft, we still found enormous values in communities of people bringing in their ideas and fixes and new features into the software.
So you recently acquired Deus.
Yeah.
And really interesting company in the container space, and they have a heritage of open source behind them. And I'm curious on how you integrate new companies and into kind of thinking about their background and roots as open source companies and how it fits in with the Microsoft culture.
Yeah, absolutely. What really attracted me to the DS team was the people and their involvement upstream in open source projects. Both their knowledge, their enthusiasm, and the culture, which is still a little different from Microsoft. And I came to Microsoft as part of the Visio acquisition in 2000. So I really do not want to change that culture. I want to bring the best of that culture into Microsoft and make those folks successful. So we're definitely maintaining and in fact accelerating our investments in open source in the areas and the projects they were working on before.
How are you increasing those investments?
Well, we basically folded the team into our Azure Container Service team, and that team was already growing. So between the people that they already had and additional people, that's the way we're increasing.
And maybe stepping back a little bit, and we're going and take us into this Deus story. When you are developing open source projects, what is your insourcing strategy? What do you do internally to help prepare for open source projects that you're going to be involved in?
I'm not sure I
I'm
understand the
trying.
question.
I'm trying to understand your internal processes. Like,
I see.
what do you have learned, right? I mean, a lot like Capital One talks about inner source, right? Like how they go through this process of collaboration. They're trying to figure out, like, well, you know, do we want to open source a certain technology, right? And if so, how are we going to do it? Like, what is that process? I'm curious on how Microsoft's culture is adapting and developing in relation to that.
Okay. Well, there's two things. There's one place is where we're going out and taking a piece of open source,
Right.
and then we're absorbing it ourselves and using it ourselves. And that comes with two things. One is we look to see what customers are using and other partners are using. We also just make technical bets. We see a piece of software like Docker was a great example. Before we saw a lot of people using it, we just knew as developers ourselves that sort of technology would be attractive. And so then you go off and you kind of have to be careful, how you approach a community and who you talk to. The other side of the thing is when we decide.
Meaning you have to make sure that you're going to the people who are leading the project and making sure you're not going to, upset things or whatever it might be.
Right. Now this is becoming the case less and less, but if you go to a small open source project and you come in and say, hey, we're here from Microsoft, and we're here to save the day, that isn't generally received very well.
No.
You want to have some developers, honestly, and you can see this in every open source community, some of them are just a little more charming than others, and better at working with others. So that's one aspect. The other thing then is how do we decide to open source something? And increasingly, if you look, most of our new projects like TypeScript or VS Code actually start in open source. In a case like .NET, where we had been working on it in proprietary internal models for a long time, there's a lot of preparation that goes into that. You have to clean up the code. You have to set up a process so that people can easily contribute, that pull requests can be accepted, that code can be reviewed.
So, how is that reflecting in the culture at Microsoft now? How do you see this change emerging, where the rest of the industry is moving towards open source, right? So you are not alone, right?
Yeah.
But every company has its own particular, cultural change that they go through. What is that cultural change at Microsoft?
Well, honestly, we've been doing this for a while, and it's just accelerating enormously. When I'm preparing for my talk tomorrow about open source, I wanted to bring together some stories about open source at Microsoft, and I was kind of overwhelmed with choices. I mentioned TypeScript, Visual Studio Code, .NET, all the activity that's going in .NET, us using things like Docker, like Kubernetes, Apache Mesos, all these things. So it's spreading through the company. There's just more and more people. Some of them, of course, grew up. Either we hired them from somewhere else or they come straight out of college where they're used to working in open source. So the cultural change is grassroots. At the same time, obviously, executives, Satya, Scott Guthrie, and others are very much heavily encouraging the teams to do more with open source because of this community aspect, the strength of the community, the incredible feedback loop that you get if you're developing software in open source.
Yeah, it does create quite a difference, and and just how people work together, it's just a different kind of thing entirely. So when new companies come in, right, like DS, and for example, like DS, do you just have them keep continuing what they do? What is your what is their process, of any, when you have really talented people like that come into the company?
Well, whenever you do an acquisition, you theoretically, just like a VC is when you're trying to fund a company, the top asset is usually the people. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you don't break all their processes and do things. And especially in a case like this where a lot of it is the culture of upstream and open source that we're trying to preserve and bring more of that DNA into Microsoft. I will say, having been through both sides of acquisitions, culture combination is always challenging.
Yeah.
And you have to, again, the main thing is to get the team to act as one team as soon as possible, get them to socialize. Developers are kind of a cliquish bunch, as you can see from open source and everything else. And so you have to get them to know each other, to be comfortable with each other, and try and mix them in and getting to working together as quickly as possible.
Right. So what are some of the tell us a little bit about your job inside Microsoft right now and how it relates to this open source story that you're going to be talking about tomorrow. I know you're working with in the Azure group and so tell us a little bit about your job and what you do across the organization.
Okay, so I sit right in the staff that runs the Azure core team, and I'm an architect, and I've mostly designed software. I designed the management plane for Azure a few years ago, but as I mentioned, really my goal is developer experiences for customers and partners using Azure, and so much of what people are using in the cloud is coming from open source and coming from other companies. Not everything is Microsoft anymore, so my focus has moved outside. So the last couple of years, honestly, I've spent a lot of time meeting with partners, going to conferences, reading, a lot of stuff that can only be classified as business development, working on deals with Docker, with Chef, with HashiCorp, Linux vendors.
Yeah.
It's a very technical world.
Yeah.
And things are changing so fast. You really have to have a mix of business and technology and community involved in order to really succeed.
Right, and you need to figure out how you deploy people, like I expect, across those different open source projects. I expect, right?
Yep, and picking the right people. Like I mentioned, some people are just a little not as good in open source communities as others, and we've got some spectacular examples of success. Like one of the ones I'm most proud of is John Howard from the Windows team, who's now the number 4 contributor to Docker all time and the biggest contributor in the last 12 months.
Wow, that's amazing. And so tell us a little bit about particular technologies like the container landscape. There's so many different projects related to the container ecosystem. There's if you think about just the core development that's being done around OCI, right?
Yeah.
The format and the runtime, or there's other projects like Kubernetes, right? You have Docker Swarm, right, which is on the Docker side. How are you how do you approach that kind of a massive ecosystem that's emerging out of that?
Yeah, I always talk about how in the cloud world everything's changing so fast. I spend a lot of time just trying to read and catch up and understand what's going on, and the container space is just like the ultimate almost in that thing.
Yeah.
There's so much going on, and we have to miss things. I do actually mention that your site is one of the places I go for news, Hacker News and places like that. I actually track every day what the trending projects on GitHub are to find out. There's something new that's showing up every day, and we can't do it all.
Right.
So at some point, that's one of the reasons, again, we hired the DS team, is because they were working on Helm, which I think is it's package manager for Kubernetes. I think is a really important technology that we were going to have to work on, whether we had those guys or not. And then the SIG service broker, which is a way to discover services in a cloud and use them from either a Cloud Foundry or a Kubernetes project. And this was another thing that we were already starting working on. And now we have people that are very, very influential and experienced in that community working with us.
It's curious on how then, how that all becomes part of the Microsoft product line. Then, how do you approach that?
Well, these particular projects have a very natural affinity for the Azure Container Service. With Azure Container Service, rather than write our own orchestrator, we're using standard open source orchestrators, the 3 that you mentioned, Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, and DCOS Mesosphere, which is based on Apache Mesos. And but then integrating it into a service makes it easier to manage and deploy. So Helm and the service broker stuff will naturally work with that product, improving the experience and hopefully driving a lot more usage.
How do you give back then out to the community itself then?
Well, many of these projects, if not most of them, we're just in the GitHub projects. Helm is a Kubernetes incubation project.
So you're contributing.
Yep, we're contributing. we have now maintainers and as well as contributors in a lot of these projects.
Has that increased? Tell us about that. Like,
Yeah, it's just increasing every year. The numbers and both breadth of projects, depth of projects, Microsoft origin projects like TypeScript or .NET, as well as projects coming from somewhere else like Docker or Mesos or Kubernetes.
so I'm always curious again about like how companies work internally, because I remember seeing a presentation by Facebook a few years ago where they were talking about how they worked with engineers and developers, who were interested in participating in open source projects, or maybe even starting their own open source project, right? And they had their GitHub profiles kind of connected back into their Facebook accounts, right?
Yeah.
And so then you could start to see kind of what people are working on.
Yeah.
What is your guys' approach?
We have the same thing. We have something called the Open Source Program Office, and they build a bunch of tools so that we can track usage of open source across projects. Sometimes it's for compliance reasons, but it's just a kind of a way of keeping tabs on everything. It's a very lightweight process. If a team wants to use an open source component, they just submit the component and it goes through a pretty much completely automated review now to get approval to do that thing. And so that's, for example, how I know that there's about 15,000 Microsoft employees with GitHub accounts that are contributing to, I don't remember the exact number, like 9,000 different projects. And then when we open source things too, there's still a little coordination, how are we going to name it, make sure that we're not stepping on some sort of partner or something else. But it's more and more grassroots and lightweight, just kind of a tracking rather than some sort of formal approval process.
How do you make it inclusive? So there's so everyone gets their chance. How do you manage that internally? So, so people who may not necessarily be senior members of the team still get to participate, or maybe they're like, you want to have a kind of just a deeper kind of representation.
Sure. Well, some of it's training. Honestly, a lot of places I see the less senior people jumping into open source quicker than the more senior people, because some of us who have been at Microsoft since before we did a lot of open source aren't as comfortable in those communities, whereas we get somebody straight out of college and oftentimes they've been contributing source to some project before they ever came to Microsoft, and they just continue in that mode. And then it just varies from project to project. If all you want to do is contribute upstream to a project, that may be a great thing to do, but at the same time, if you're running a service, you have a lot of responsibility to make sure that service is hitting its SLAs.
So when you're you're developing these these open source projects, and you're working on them, to increasing the number of maintainers that you have, and starting building out your own open source community. What are some of the observations that you have about the overall open source landscape out there? I mean, some of the things you're starting to see, I think, as kind of challenges are just like the organizational challenges that come when open source communities grow so much.
Yeah. No, I know this is a topic you've discussed.
Yeah.
And a lot of us are kind of watching, especially like with the CNCF, where suddenly everybody's piling in.
Right.
And is it going to become, a debating society or a mess rather than just a productive community? That's a real concern. And we have like Brendan Burns, who works at Microsoft now, is one of the people that's really trying to make sure that doesn't turn out that way. Open source is like anything else. At the end, it's a lot of people, and some communities are healthy and friendly, and then we are talking about the internet, so there's a lot of communities that aren't that way.
Right. Interesting. So you're talking tomorrow about open source projects. We're going to be publishing this, past your talk tomorrow. Yeah. What are some of the themes you're going to touch on?
Well, I've touched on a lot of them here, but I mean, really, if you ever listen to Barry or Adam at Chef talking about how organizations have to change to adapt to a rapid pace, I'm going to be talking about Microsoft.
Yeah.
Now, we're already a software company. Barry said this morning, everybody's turning into a software company. Well, Microsoft is an exception because we've already been one. But I'm going to talk about how open source is really changing how we develop software, how we interact with our customers, how we interact with other partners.
Excellent. Well, you're also, I guess, in conclusion, you're also members of the Linux. You're members of the Linux Foundation now.
Yeah.
Which is fun to see, right?
Yeah.
And there have been, I'm sure you hear, there's all kinds of stories that date back to the Linux Microsoft, tete-a-tete, let's just say, of years past. What is the, what is your guys, mission on, as part of the Linux Foundation? What is your drive? What are the driving kind of things you're trying to bring into the Linux Foundation, as being a major new member?
Yeah. So we've been contributing to Linux for 8 years, or maybe a little longer than that now. So and we've got more and more Linux usage on Azure. So we felt it's partly our responsibility to step up and really support that development. And that's one of the reasons we joined the organization, particularly on Linux. But the Linux Foundation is also becoming an umbrella organization for a lot of other things. So there's the Open Container Initiative, and there's the various networking foundations and other things that are running inside Linux foundations. So by the time we joined the parent body, we were already members, I think, of 9 of the subgroups at the Linux Foundation. And that's why we're contributing.
So what will your investment be going forward in the Linux Foundation and open source overall? I mean, what is the, it's one thing, that to recognize that Microsoft is adopting open source, but I'm curious about the investments that you will make, and as it relates to kind of open source projects.
Yeah, I can't predict all the places we're going to invest, but we are just doing more and more every year. We're hiring people, acquisitions like Dias to bring in talent that have things, and we'll continue to be very involved in those communities.
Well, I guess we'll. It goes without saying that that'll encompass containers in some respect.
Oh yeah, containers are sweeping the nation, and then, but that ecosystem, as much as it's 3 years old, is still awfully young.
Yeah, it is.
When I was at DockerCon, I said we were working with Docker for 3 years, and I said that's like 21 in cloud years.
I enjoyed the keynotes this morning. Did you go?
Yeah, I did.
And listening to them talk about continuous automation, and this idea of continuous compliance, really, as well. And I'm always kind of thinking about, well, what does this mean for a company like Chef? And it seems like, again, just like any other company, you see this transformation, not just with what they're trying to convince customers to do, but with what they're doing as well. And I see them as kind of like as more of an automation company now than as a configuration management company.
Yes, that's right.
Do you share that?
Yeah, their products spread out. It was Chef for configuration management, and then Inspect for doing compliance was obviously an incredibly valuable and necessary thing for any sort of enterprise. Right. And now Habitat is this new technology where they're bundling up all the things that it takes to run an application into one place and increasing the manageability of like that. So they got a nice little product line. It's got a lot of great functionality, but I think in many ways just their approach is even more important. The thing I always love about ChefConf, this is my 4th ChefConf, I've been coming since 2013, is just the energy and enthusiasm about that community. Yeah. It's just a love fest. It's one of the just most high energy conferences I've ever been to.
Yeah. So do you, as far as, it makes me think about Chef and kind of automation, is that an investment area for Microsoft in terms of containers? Yeah,
we've been working with Chef. There's a session today about using Habitat on top of Azure Container Service. We've been working with Chef for 5 years. It's one of the first open source partners I worked with on getting Chef automation into our marketplace so that people can use it. And actually another thing that's interesting is that we are pretty big Chef customers. We have across MSN, Bing and Office 365 and Azure, a bunch of nodes where people are using Chef ourselves and contributing back to the cookbooks and other things like that in the community.
Well, John, thank you very much for taking some time to talk today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and good luck with your talk tomorrow, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Hey, we've had a great time here in Austin, Texas for Chef Conf. We've had some terrific interviews with people who've been talking about open source, continuous automation, the new complexities of AI and compliance and security. We really covered it all. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Bakers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.